So welcome back to the second segment of Citizens Forum. And today we have with us Allan Cassels. He's a drug researcher, centered at the University of Victoria. He has written an article that's called Concocted War on the Drug Industry, Another Wag the Dog Scenario in Common Ground in June of 2016, just published. And basically the byline says BC Liberals can't afford a real war against pharma, so they'll fake one. So Allan, I know you wrote this article in Common Ground, and it's just out right now, and I really think it's pertinent to a lot of things that's happening in British Columbia right now with this government. And basically, maybe you could just walk us through how governments decide what drugs are going to be covered.
Yeah, you know, part of the reason why this article is very pertinent is that the Liberal government brought in a new policy in the last 2 weeks that affects how they're going to pay for drugs.
Yeah.
And the NDP in the mid-90s did a very similar policy called reference-based pricing. It's very controversial. It really brought down the heavy guns from the pharmaceutical industry. It was basically attacking the government. And it was a policy that was essentially said, if you've got drugs in a basket of treatments that are equally effective, you would pay for the cheapest one first with public money, right?
Yeah.
And you know, if that drug doesn't work for a particular person, they can apply to have the government cover, you know, another one. So it was a way to sort of keep a lid on the growth of the drug budget. Yeah. Again, very controversial. The pharmaceutical industry hated reference-based pricing. They attacked the government, the NDP government.
But it did save money, didn't it?
It saved a lot of money, and this is back when the provincial drug budget was about $400 million. It saved about 10 to say maybe 12% off that budget, without any effect on patients.
40, 50 million bucks a year.
Yeah, exactly. And that's money that would be pharmaceutical industry profits. So of course, the drug companies were really upset, and they attacked the government. So you know, fast forward 20 years later, you've got a Liberal government that everyone agrees is way too cozy with the pharmaceutical industry. They've brought in a number of policies that have really shown how they're kind of bending over backwards to make sure that the companies are going to continue to maintain their profits. And critics like myself and other researchers have looked at this and said, you know, this is a very unhealthy kind of relationship between the government.
Yeah, and we've seen lots of, I don't know if you mentioned this in the article, but there's lots of instances of you did actually talk about funding.
Yes.
And how the relationships seem to be there.
Well, you know, if the pharmaceutical industry is kicking in, you know, several $100,000 per election campaign to one party and not the other party, you would think that they would expect some payback. Yeah. And so this recent Liberal policy that came in, we suspect, when I say we, I'm not the only one that has sort of you know, observed this, we suspect that this is the concoction of a phony war.
Yeah.
So they want to demonstrate to the public that they are hard against, they're standing up tough to the pharmaceutical companies. They don't want to be seen as that they're in the pockets of the drug companies. And so they'll bring out this mild policy, which will, you know, look like you're playing tough.
Yeah, like, do you think this is stemming from, you know, in the past with the scandal that firing the healthcare workers and all that, and a lot came out during that time that did indicate that there was a very close relationship between the pharmaceutical companies and the government.
We do know, when you look at, say, lobbyist registries and see who is actually going into the Parliament, to the BC legislature, meeting with the health minister and the other advanced education minister, so on, you see a lot of presence of Pfizer, Novartis, the big drug companies that are going there and making sure that their drugs are front and center, and that the politicians are aware of them. You know, as a researcher, I think that's a very unhealthy perspective. I think you should be making drug policy decisions based on good evidence, good research, not on who shows up to lobby you and who shows up giving you political donations.
By the way, what other provinces have this sort of agency that looks at drugs and tries to find equivalents and all that?
Well, I mean, every province has an agency that does some level of assessment of the evidence.
Yeah.
The difference in BC that we had under the previous government was that there was a firewall between the agency and the pharmaceutical companies.
Yeah.
They did not allow themselves to be lobbied. They did not allow the pharmaceutical companies to come in and do any schmoozing.
Yeah.
And so Without that, you get good, clean, clear information about
For
drugs.
instance, I was going to ask you one more question around how this sort of works, because that's always interesting how they make these decisions. Now, during that controversy, there was a lot being said about these smoking cessation drugs that the drug companies were wanting to sell. And was it that same agency finding that maybe some of those drugs weren't effective?
Well, we couldn't find that out because the people that were studying those particular drugs, the smoking cessation drugs, they were fired in the big firing scandal in 2012. So, just put it this way, researchers that were going to possibly discover safety problems with drugs which the Premier has announced are wonderful and are going to be paid for by the government, those researchers are fired and that research never continues. So we don't know we essentially have not added to the safety picture of those drugs.
So that research was never started again.
No.
Even though they mostly have all been reinstated, haven't they? Don't they have pretty well back to square one?
Except for the guy that committed suicide. Which is unfortunate. And he was actually working on the smoking cessation treatment. And one of the ironies of the whole thing is that was actually one of the potential dangers of this drug, is that increased risk of psychiatric effects, including suicides.
So, and that's a very interesting case and a very sad, very, very sad situation where a researcher was just so near getting his PhD, and once he lost his job, he never completed his PhD.
That's right. And so that was obviously tragic. Yeah. But the tragedy continues in the fact the government did not, renew the research that they originally thought was important. And that was one of several research studies colleagues of mine were working on. It fit a pattern of this sort of scandalous relationship between the government and the pharmaceutical industry. And again, that's why I wrote the article this month, is that they realize that they're facing the electorate next year. They have to do something to whitewash their reputation, because it's starting to get known in the community, certainly in the research world, that they're way too cozy to the drug companies.
Well, I think that's happening worldwide. And I always think, too, that even though we're a little British Columbia in Canada and, not a huge market like you'd have in the States or in Europe, but when you get decisions made about people who are screening drugs and they start pointing to a certain drug and saying, maybe that's not that good, and we don't want to cover it perhaps under our healthcare system, that other jurisdictions are going to look at that and go, wow, maybe they have something there.
See that is part of the problem. If you've got a province that has a very hard line and a very evidence-based approach to drug coverage, the other provinces are going to go, why can't we do things like BC? And in fact, we had under the leadership of the Therapeutics Initiative, this group at UBC, this independently funded group that was doing these kinds of drug assessments. Well, certainly under this government, they've continued to lose their influence and their funding.
So that's
that's fitting the pattern of let's play nice with the drug companies. There are partners. And you can read whatever you want into that, but I don't think you really want to partner with companies that have known criminal records. And I don't say that lightly. The major pharmaceutical companies, Pfizer, Novartis, GlaxoSmithKline, they've all had criminal charges and criminal and civil charges against them in the U.S., paid fines of several $1 billion for off-label marketing of drugs, for illegal promotion, and so on. And
so off-label, you mean using a drug that might have been for one thing?
That's right.
Now being used for something else.
So this drug is for smoking cessation. Well, we're going to market it as an antidepressant, for example,
or weight loss,
or weight loss pill. So they do this, and that's illegal, and the companies have faced fairly significant criminal fines. A colleague of mine in Denmark wrote a book a few years ago called Deadly Medicines and Organized Crime, talking about really the connections or the similarities between the major pharmaceutical companies and the mafia in terms of the way they operate and the kind of way that they're able to sort of control their markets.
Well, they have the budget for huge public relations enterprises, and obviously they exercise their abilities because that they want to sell products.
Sure.
And you sort of say, well, isn't that awful? But we have a government, on the other hand, and they're supposed to go to bat for us. That's what last time I checked.
Yes.
And this is what I'm finding is that so many times on so many issues, it could be with mining or logging or healthcare, and you go right down the line. Every time you see all these things piling up, these conflicts piling up, and you see, you realize that your elected representatives really aren't there for you. And thank you for writing this article, because I think people have to be thinking a little bit outside the box, particularly when you're looking at mainstream media and how information's coming into us. And if we don't have these perspectives that show that we should be scrutinizing these arrangements a lot more carefully, and we're obviously not getting that information in our everyday newspaper or whatever.
Well, we're not. And at the end of the day, you and I and our mothers and fathers and grandparents are taking drugs. We expect that the decisions that have been made to approve and cover those drugs have been made independently and unbiasedly.
Now, I want to ask you, you brought a book today, and I know it's called the Cochrane Collaboration, and just tell us who the Cochrane Group is.
So the Cochrane Collaboration is probably one of the best independent sources of drug and medical information in the world. It's largely a volunteer organization where they do critical assessments of trials, of research around drugs and other treatments, and try to synthesize that so that you get the pure stuff. You know, one of the founders of the Cochrane Collaboration, I interviewed over 160 people to write this book. One of the founders said to me that clean, clear health information is as important as clean, clear water. And the Cochrane Collaboration is about distilling health information so it is pure.
Right now, who do these guys work for? How do they make their living?
The collaboration, they're mostly funded by governments. The UK government, the Canadian government, the government grants and so on. And like I say, largely volunteers that are doing this work.
Now, in that book, do you actually talk about specific drugs?
So, you know, specific, what they specialize in is doing what's called meta-analysis. If you want to know whether a drug works, you don't look at this trial and that trial and this trial. You take all the trials, you put them together. There is fairly complex algorithms that you can crunch the numbers, and you get a definitive idea of whether the drug works better than, say, placebo or not. And that's what the Cochrane Collaboration specializes in.
So that could be one of the reasons to read that book. I mean, just for that. And I understand the politics, I think, is that we all have to be hip to the scene when making a decision, especially with drugs. And there's so many people die every year. I don't know how many hundreds of thousands. You might know the number, but that die from the wrong prescriptions, taking the wrong drug at the wrong time, and all that.
And drugs interact with each other, and people often will get too high a dose, or you know, they'll be taking too many drugs, or they'll get drugs for side effects of other drugs they're taking. You're right. It's some researchers, colleagues of mine, have said that adverse drug reactions is about somewhere between the 4th and 5th leading cause of death.
Wow, that's really, really significant. So, Allan, thank you so much for coming by. It's always so interesting to talk to you, and I know in the future we want to have you back and see how things are going with this government.
There's lots to talk about.
It's really, really appreciated. So that's it for this segment of Citizens Forum.